the Age of Uncertainty podcast by Nigel. The Nigel scale versus scaling frameworks.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Age of Uncertainty podcast. This one is all about the Nigel scale versus scaling frameworks. Now, before we get going, there is a little bit of prior learning you may need to do for this video. It's all about the Nigel scale, and as one of our earlier episodes, I believe it was episode 3. So if you would like, I'd recommend watching that 15-minute video first to get an understanding of the Nigel scale and then come back here. Watched it? Brilliant. For those of you that couldn't be bothered to spend 15 minutes on it, I'm going to give a quick 30-second resume. The Nigel scale is a method I came up with over a decade ago, basically splitting Scrum specifically, but Agile in general, into 3 key areas. Nigel scale 1, 2, 3. Number 1 is the core, the fundamentals, the stuff that if you bend it, everything breaks horribly. Number 2, Nigel scale 2, is the good practices that work for a lot of us in many contexts, but we've got to be very aware that they're contextual. Just because they work for you and work for me, they may not work for everyone. And Nigel scale 3 is Antipatterns, bad behaviours, anti-agile stuff that really doesn't work and is going to get us into a lot of trouble. Now, I used to like applying the Nigel scale on many Scrum implementations because many people thought what was Scrum wasn't, things like visions at the time, which I believe is becoming Scrum soon, but things like user stories, velocity story points that they thought was core fundamental Scrum. It's actually good practice to work for some of us, but not all of us. And some people even brought in negative anti-patterns, things like sprint 0, hardening sprints, and assumed they were Scrum, when in fact they're not even good. Well, the idea behind this video is to actually apply that Nigel scale of core, good, bad, and turn that lens onto the most famous scaling frameworks available in the market. Warning time! I'm going to tell you now, I have done research on this, but this is my own personal opinion. Feel free to disagree with my opinion. Right? I am relying on the publicly available texts. I don't want to spend my entire life studying scaling frameworks, so I'm relying on my own experience and my own reading of those public texts. So it may be there is some nuance I'm missing, though I would say if it's too nuanced, it's going to be missed by everyone. 2 things I would like to look at, though, before we go into that deep dive, is ing over ed. What do I mean by that? Well, changing over changed, transforming over transformed, scaling over scaled. Most of my concerns with these methods they are about ed, actually. They are scaled methods, not scaling methods. But we'll look again at that and we deep dive. My other big concern is about a lot of these methods seem to be confusing big with lots. Lots could be dozens of products with dozens of Scrum teams going in dozens of directions. That's a very, very different problem space to big, which is one product with lots of people working on it going on in one direction. Okay? Never confuse big with lots. It seems to me some of the work we're going to look at does exactly that. So the methods we're going to look at today are the Scaled Agile Framework, SAFe, Large Scale Scrum, LESS, Scrum at Scale, and Nexus. Sorry, I'm not going to look at Disciplined Agile Delivery by Scott Ambler. Life's just too short to get caught up with that sort of stuff. So feel free to put that all in the NS3 bucket as far as I'm concerned. I'm going to look at specifically the large ones. SAFe, LESS, Scrum at Scale, and Nexus. So let's look at the big dog in the market, SAFe. There have been hundreds of thousands of people potentially certified in the Scaled Agile Framework. But just remember, just because it's the big dog doesn't make it the alpha male. I have many concerns with SAFe. Let's use the Nigel scale to bring out those concerns. Well, concern number 1 is looking at the large scale picture on its own. If we look at that big picture on its own and apply the Nigel scale to that, I would say it's NS3 and anti-pattern. For one simple reason. It wraps in anti-patterns with good practices, with essential practices, and treats them all the same. That picture gives it all those patterns the same equivalence, whether they're good, bad, or core. And that is an anti-pattern. SAFe really should distinguish between core, good, and bad. Now, to give it some credit, it does do that a little bit. There are now various flavours of SAFe that you can look at. There's sort of the enterprise or the full SAFe, the portfolio SAFe, and essential SAFe. So even SAFe are making it clear that some of their stuff isn't needed, isn't essential, isn't usable very well. So I would look at that and see the differences between essential and full and be ruthless with the stuff that appears in full that isn't an essential. So all that stuff around portfolio, around that full organisational area, I think I would be very, very ruthless with and cull in most situations. In terms of anti-pattern, I think there are three key areas for me. One of them is around the roles. I see a lot of anti-pattern around those jobs, about the creation of new jobs, things like solutions architects and solution management, enterprise architects, that type of role I think is very anti-pattern-y. That is drawing away the empowerment of the team, removing away their ability to self-organise and emerge solutions, and thus I would regard that as dangerous. But other issues around train engineers themselves, release train engineers, that entire name wraps them into a solution that may not be appropriate. Now, I quite like release trains. I would have them as NS2. They're a good practice for many people. But a release train in the idea of time is fixed, people are fixed, so scope is the only thing that can give. The train pulls out the station, whether your scope is on it or not. I think that's a legitimate idea in some organisations. However, I see many organisations misusing trains, treating them more like wagon carts filled with cattle, and they ram the cattle in, shut the cart doors when they're squealing inside, and then try and force it there and on time and on budget, with no variance or variability in that scope. See the use of the word commitment in far too many places in the SAFe world. That commitment aspect, you're going to get it all done whether you can or not, I think is an anti-pattern. And having release train engineers, that basically forces them into that pattern of owning the train, looking after the train. I would prefer, rather than a wagon train concept, or even rather than just a standard release train concept, could we go a bit more futuristic, a bit more modern, and have it like the London Underground, where we have so frequent releases we don't have to worry about scope being in and out of a release? I personally don't run for the London Underground because there's always another tube in 2 minutes. Why would I run and kill myself? Or even better than the London Underground, I prefer a motorway concept where scope can flow in and off, continuous delivery effectively. Scope can flow in and out, products can flow in and out of delivery without having to have some huge release train release cycle. Because this brings up my other big concern with SAFe, is that it's effectively a portfolio management tool. It's about managing lots, not about managing big products. And that lots aspect means supplying some really inappropriate metaphors to this. I wouldn't want to have dozens of products all stuck into a 90-day cycle. I think that would be ridiculous. They should all have their own release trains in their own cycles with their own iteration and their own learning capabilities. Other stuff that concerns me, Nigel Scale 3 in terms of SAFe, things like solution intent, that seems to be very much a traditional requirements database with loads of traceability and accuracy and measurability. I think that's a little bit dangerous in our space. Another concern I have, which you actually may not, is with large-scale PI planning, these huge meta-release planning events. I know a lot of people out there like them, so I'm not going to put NS3 on them because you may find them useful. They may be a good practice for you, but for me, I've never seen them work that effectively. Well, that's not true. I've seen 10% of the attendees of those planning sessions getting loads of value out of it, loads of response, but 90% of the audience just hating them. I have great apathy for them, and I have a lot of sympathy for that 90%. But I think there's an anti-pattern we can all agree on, which is team backlogs. It needs to be product backlogs. The clue's in the title. It's product focused, not team focused. If your backlogs become team focused, you can end up with a wealth of dependencies, a wealth of weights, a wealth of blocks, and you can have a lot of teams deliver stuff that doesn't actually add up to cumulative value. So team backlogs is something I'll be very terrified about here. In terms of roles, we talked about solution architect, release train engineers being a concern. I have a concern around the Scrum team itself. I'm just a bit worried about how product owner and Scrum masters are utilised in SAFe. If you look at the job descriptions in SAFe, they're actually slightly neutered compared to the classic Scrum descriptions. Product owner seems to effectively be a proxy on that team backlog, a team output owner effectively, and the poor old Scrum Masters seem to have the change agency, the organisational improvement side of their job completely culled away. They are neutered to become effectively process wonks for their Scrum teams. That neutering of the Scrum Masters and that neutering of the product owners can cause a massive, not flattening of hierarchy, but a squishing of self-organising empowered Scrum teams. We've got to get those two roles working well. If you don't, you end up with a Scrum team that could be a bit crap, and if you scale crap, you get diarrhea. That, I think, is a bit of an anti-pattern. And if you look at the diagram at a high level, there's only about 4% of the picture actually devoted to the Agile teams, when in reality they are 99% of this entire approach. I feel that is an anti-pattern as well, giving the wrong impression to the type of people who will be looking at these types of pictures. One last thing here about this framework is about the idea of putting the SAFe program consultant as part of the framework, as part of the big picture. There are two factors to the SAFe program consultant model that I don't like having in this picture. One is it could be a bit pyramid selly, i.e. you have someone in there who's to encourage more use of SAFe. That seems a little bit dodgy to me. But more fundamental than that, the idea that you need to have a specialist expert to help you actually do this. We all know that SAFe comes from Dean Leffingwell, and Dean Leffingwell's original work is the Rational Unified process, being very involved in that in the late 90s. And I remember RUP requiring experts to come in to help you configure the darn thing. It was so overly complex and difficult. And if we're sort of hinting here that you need someone of similar skills to come in and help us configure and manage this overly complex solution, well, that's not really Agile, is it? This isn't the simplest thing that could possibly work. But there are some good core things here in SAFe. SAFe has got the Scrum teams in there, extreme programming in there. That's key. They're also talking about product backlogs in there, which I really appreciate. So this is like a fundamental core within there. And they've got some good practices wrapped in there as well. Options for Kanban, options for design thinking. But I'm a little concerned how it's been just stuck in the middle of the diagram. Putting a picture of a customer at the center of your picture does not put the customer at the center of your thoughts. I will be honest there. But at least it's being mentioned. My worry is those good practices, Kanban, extreme programming, design thinking, communities of practice, putting them in there as if they are essential core practices is actually an anti-pattern in itself. So treating a good practice like a core practice is a huge error. We have to understand this stuff is flexible, it is malleable depending on the situation. And I don't feel SAFe communicates that anywhere nearly effective enough. Do you know what? That could be its great attractor. Its out-the-box methodology look could be quite attractive to organisations. Because organisations have always wanted some sort of methodology they could apply straight out the box, with loads of paperwork that doesn't require much thinking. This quote here is from Alistair Coburn. It's from the wiki he and others were putting together before they came together for the first Lightweight Methods Conference. That was the famous event where they wrote the Agile Manifesto. So this issue's been around for a long time, and most of the Agile movement was actually created to deal or handle with this issue. And my concern is SAFe embraces it. That could actually be quite attractive to executives and senior leaders in organisations. I'm just concerned about how that actually works in practice, as we're seeing in industry at the moment. Now let's look at LESS, large-scale Scrum, the second most popular scaling method out there. I believe about 10,000 people have been certified in this one. Now, if you look at LESS, it's actually very, very, very aligned with Scrum. Most of what LESS is 95% Scrum. And so those core Scrum practices are reflected in those LESS practices. There's tight alignment there. There's a lot of that NS1. And surrounding it are lots of NS2, are good practices that I think many organisations would find useful. Things such as lean thinking and systems thinking, which are areas I think in large-scale complex work we really need to embrace. There's a huge focus on technology there and a huge focus on coaching and adoption. So in general, I find those good practices very tightly aligned with what I would do in organisations with that core fundamental framework in the place. So this is all looking pretty good to me. But I do have some concerns. My NS3, my anti-pattern stuff here, I don't know it's fair if it's to call it anti-patterns, but my concern is around how they've done product owner and their associated area product owners and requirement areas. I always feel that's been a bit of a fudge in there about product ownership. It always used to be said there is one product owner working with self-organising teams and that's it. And I've always found that a little bit extreme. But then the safe model of having a fake product owner on every team, I've also found to be a huge anti-pattern as well. What I tend to do personally is look at the shape of the product and the shape of value delivery, and that can normally hint to you the way the team should be shaped and thus the way the product is shaped. I actually do believe that many large products are actually a collection of sub-products. And so I don't mind having more than one product owner in a product experience. I'm not a believer of only one product owner with 1,000 developers, but I'm definitely not a follower of the safe model of one product owner on every team, owning the team's output but not actually owning the product. There's something between the two. I don't think any scaling method has really got that right yet. I think safe may be furthest away. I think less may be closest to getting a better solution there, but I do feel that may be an area where there may never be one core fundamental practice, and there may have to be a range of good practices depending on the shape of the product. Two interesting things about less. One is the feature team concept, having a team that can go down the entire end-to-end stack. I would call that a good practice, only because it may not be physically possible in some areas of work, but for most teams I really think that feature team going end-to-end delivering value is what we should mostly be aiming for. Less also has sprint planning part 1 and part 2. That we all used to do in traditional Scrum. These days Scrum's a little bit more flexible on that. It's a bit more of a potpourri sprint planning, but I can understand why Les still recommends it. The idea is all the teams can attend part 1 and they can go off into their own separate part 2s to discuss how, but in my experience part 1 and part 2 mesh anyway. The gap between what and how is often overlapping, and so having them as 2 separate sessions, it may be a good practice for some people, but I wouldn't actually say that's a full fundamental practice for everyone. Let's look at Nexus from scrum.org. Now here's my concern with Nexus. I've not actually seen it done in real life. I've seen people talk about it online. I think there's been about 2,000 people certified in it, but I've never seen a real life implementation of it. So I can only judge it from the paperwork, unlike Less and Safe when I've seen them in real life in multiple instances. In terms of Nexus on paper, looks pretty good. Looks pretty tight to Scrum for me. Very, very similar to Scrum. In fact, very highly aligned with Less as well. If you squint at them, they could both look very similar. But there are a couple of bits of Nexus that concern me. Would I call them NS3? I think it would get close to that in many implementations of it. My concerns about the Nexus team itself and how that's worded in Nexus. It seems to be a derivative of a sort of recommendation of integration teams that we used to have, a bit like that system team idea in Safe, but this time it's people who could potentially be on dev teams but are devoted to the integration team to building that integration capability for those teams' work to come together. I'm a little bit concerned about that. I don't really want like a separate integration tools team. I don't like that in Scrum. I don't think that'll work well. If one team thinks about integration, it means you'll have 20 teams that are now not thinking about integration. Correspondingly, if that's the team of people who are just working on organisational impediments and organisational issues, that can become almost a management Scrum rather than an integration Scrum, dealing with all the politics. And again, I don't want to add a new management team to this sat above the Scrum teams. So I know they're being careful to word this in the Nexus guide, and I'm sure I may be misunderstanding it. I am here looking at it with my black hat on, being concerned about that Nexus team shape. I do something similar to this Nexus integration team, but I do make sure it's volunteers from the individual teams, and I do need to make sure they are subservient or supportive of those individual teams and are not some sort of dominating architectural group or management group. One thing I do like what Scrum.org are doing with Nexus though is that something else that Less does is this concept of experiments in Less or suggested practices in Nexus. These are things that are not part of the framework but are ideas that they believe will work for you. So they're very much pulling that out of the framework, not sticking it all in one big picture. Now the word suggested is a bit heavy, and in fact, so I'm a bit concerned with Nexus using that. That's kind of giving those practices quite a lot of weight. The word experiment is probably better from less. That could be giving it not enough weight. Maybe something like suggested experiments, which I think is the right language for me. These are ideas that are good practices that work for many people, and they may work for you, but you've got to try them out for yourselves. Nexus has it, Less has it with a lot more experiments, but I think that mentality of separating out generally core fundamental from good practice is what makes Nexus and Less better than Safe as a scaling model. Finally, let's look at Scrum at Scale from Jeff Sutherland, one of the inventors of Scrum. Now this method comes from a very different angle to the others, but I'm not sure I like that angle. Looking at the positives, in the Scrum at Scale guide, they say Scrum is Scrum. It's exactly how we say it in the Scrum guide, so it's very tightly aligned to the official definition, as you would hope, being invented by the same person. However, there are some concerns for me. One is about the product owner and Scrum Master descriptions, how they are on every single Scrum team. And that's a bit of a concern. Now that could be an abstraction, so saying someone is playing the role on every team, but that would be a little bit weaselly, I feel. Or it could be they're saying, like Safe, every team has a Scrum Master and product owner. But my concern is those product owners can be quite low-level proxy and effectively team output owners. And that does seem to be how Scrum at Scale is describing them in a lot of their documentation. People responsible for the output of the team, not necessarily responsible for the value delivered in the overall product. Another interesting thing I am seeing in Scrum at Scale is how they're approaching product owner teams. They have this idea of the enterprise meta Scrum and the Scrum of Scrums being the main model they're using to grow the shape. Well, Scrum at Scrum seems to be using a fractal model to describe how it is scaling rather than a more flattening of hierarchy model when scaling. Sort of more fractal, less flattening. Now, is that right or wrong? Well, I've got concerns about that because it does seem to be generating quite a lot of layers of hierarchy. And though we talk about flattening hierarchy with Agile and Scrum, hierarchy isn't bad per se, but lots of it I feel can be slightly negative. And looking at some of the diagrams here, there can be quite a few layers of management being put into place above the Scrum teams. And we've got this idea of the product owner Scrum team or the product owner Scrum, which again, I'm not sure about. Maybe that's a good practice, but I feel that could be drifting into Antipattern, having the product owners run as an actual Scrum team. I like the idea in concept, but I've not really seen that in reality. I like to have a whole load of fears about that. We also have this enterprise meta Scrum idea, which, by the way, when I first saw it raised, I think it was in Portland in 2007, I jokingly said, hey, you should call it Scrumbrella, to a complete non-reaction of Jeff Sutherland. So, hey-ho, I guess it's a meta Scrum. But that meta Scrum idea, again, slightly concerns me. It's sort of talk about going Scrum to the most senior management levels. And I like the idea of that, but I'm not sure product development frameworks are applicable in this context. My concern with some of this stuff is we actually seem to be watering down what Scrum actually is. So if you claim Scrum is a team that meets and does work and reflects, well, they're doing Scrum at that level, but then surely everyone's doing Scrum at every level in any organisation. So I'm taking that with a little pinch of salt. It is interesting to see genuine change in these areas being suggested when things like Safe seem to be sticking with the old model and using traditional management model in that place. That's interesting, but I'm concerned about that. In the Nigel scale, where would I put that? Well, it's definitely not core fundamental. It's nowhere near developed enough for that. Is it a good practice? Oh, I think I'm going to put a question mark on it because I'm worried it could be a good or a negative practice. We just don't have enough knowledge about that type of approach. We need to see that outside of their recommendations and being more visible in the actual world of work. So for me, that enterprise meta Scrum has got a smell of NS3 about it, of anti-pattern, though I think I want to see more about it before I comment further. One final thing about Scrum at Scale that really bothers me is this. They talk about installing an Agile operating system, maybe running a reference model in a few example teams and then copying that across the organisation, allowing them to replicate that. I think that's possibly the worst piece of advice I've seen in this entire thing, even worse than some of the safe stuff. Copying it from one area and copying and pasting it across all your other areas is just a recipe for disaster. Just because it works that way for that particular area of your organisation does not mean it's going to work the same way in other areas. Things like sprint length, they've got to be contextual. Things like backlog item format have got to be to a certain extent contextual. I think just running experiments in one area, getting a reference model, then copying and pasting it is disastrous, and I would highly recommend avoiding that. So to conclude these methods, if I had to put them in some order, I think I'd have less first. For me, it lines mostly up with my ideology or my beliefs and seems to line closely to Scrum, which we know works quite well. Then Nexus, which is very similar to less. Then I'd probably pick Scrum at Scale, though it's got some interesting ideas, some interesting areas, and some of the shapes are weird and wonderful. It does seem to be embracing that there could be weird and wonderful shapes to products, which I don't think the other methods do. Then I'm afraid to say coming up the rear would be Safe. By far the most popular, but for me, got the most anti-patterns wrapped in, pretending not to be anti-patterns. And if we just looked at this from NS1, Agile principles, if you think of the Agile principles, what are they? Well, we're going to distill them right down. They're things like value, adaptability, being able to change, empowering people, supporting people, being able to emerge, being able to reflect, being able to talk to each other. Some of these methods seem to almost hold that back, like Safe, and some of these methods seem to embrace that a whole lot more, things like Less and Nexus. So to wrap scaling up, for me scaling is ing, not ed. So it's about growing, it's about scaling, which none of these methods talk about really. They all seem to talk about we have lots, let's make lots agile. Well, what about going from small to big? I think if we actually think about scaling as ing, as growing, then you'll realise you don't need half these people doing this work. We can actually get to a level of performance with a much smaller group of people. Ing over ed. It's also about changing over changed. These models all seem to be creating snapshots of this is what the future looks like, and I think that's dangerous. We're not supposed to be reaching some plateau of performance. We are supposed to be advancing and growing and learning constantly. You know what? Safe, I don't like it. But if we used it like almost methadone, and I apologise for the reference, but so the idea is you get them off the bad stuff, you get them off the proverbial organisational heroin and get them onto a substitute like methadone, which is safe. But the aim is not to stay on methadone forever. Methadone's pretty bad. We want to be able to transition away from any form of drug to becoming drug-free and happier in life. That's what we need to use these methods for. So Safe could be a placeholder to move from one to another. It's about changing, not changed. That's a concern. But I'm seeing that with Safe at the moment in industry, people dropping a lot of the noise and altering it and changing it as they gain maturity. I think that's really cool. I think that's really appropriate, but we've got to make sure they're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I want to make sure that they understand which key bits they need to keep doing in any agile space. So in general, we want thin, not fat. Essential, not full. Less, not more. That's what we're aiming for here. How thin can we get it? And then be very rigorous with that thinness in scaling as well as in a normal Scrum team. And it's about learning over learned. We aren't just going to go on a training course and apply this. We're going to keep running experiments, whether suggested or whether not, but run experiments to find new shapes and better ways of doing this work, evolving our approach, evolving our model, scaling rather than scaled, growing across the organisations with slightly different flavours rather than growing the same cut and paste Xerox across everyone. Here's my concern though. Knowing sells. Having the answer sells. Being certain sells. And so my concern with these courses are this is the right way of doing it and people try and apply it. Just remember, a lot of these methods are evolving. They're changing. They're being updated all the time. That's great. Yeah, we're learning more. Well, just remember where they're learning. They're learning on you. They're learning on your companies. They're learning on your careers, they're learning on your jobs. When it goes wrong and they go, whoops, that didn't quite work, let's recommend something else, that could be your career going up in smoke. So take ownership of this. Take ownership of your own approaches. Be careful. Do methods with great discipline. Understand things like Scrum are the trellis, not the plant. You want to have a good trellis to allow the plant to grow. It is especially true with scaling methods. These are basically foundational gardening supports for allow your plants to grow. But all your plants, I believe, should grow in different directions. Is that easy to sell? No. Is that easy to say in a video? Oh, yes. But that's what I would try and do. That was a controversial video. I know it was. Some of you are going to think I'm incorrect about some of my opinions here. I'm completely fine about that. Put 2 Agile coaches in a room. You'll get 3 versions of Agile. Give me some feedback on this. Let's have a discussion. Let's use this as the start, not the end. Let's talk about it in the comments below. Let's talk about it on social media. But let's get thinking about this stuff. Not in an adversarial way, not in scaling method versus scaling method, but in terms of Agile and these approaches. I think that would be really, really fascinating. Please could you share this on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, subscribe here maybe. And I've got some bad news. Our next video in the Age of Uncertainty podcast is going to be our last video in the Age of Uncertainty podcast. I know. You're all 3 of you who watch are really sad. So the next video is finale. The finale of the Age of Uncertainty podcast. And I'd love to see you here one last time to see that video. I've enjoyed this. I hope you have also. I'll see you again next time. Thank you and goodbye.
Next episode, the finale of the Age of Uncertainty podcast.